Somewhere in your life, there's probably a shelf or a folder or a drawer full of things you started with real enthusiasm and never finished. A language you were learning, an instrument you bought, a business idea half built, still sitting in a notes app somewhere, waiting for a version of you that never quite showed up again. None of those things failed because you lacked the ability to do them. Most of them failed the same way, at the same moment, for the same reason, and if you look closely, that moment usually wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. It was the point where the excitement wore off and the work started looking exactly like work. Here's a question worth asking honestly. How many things have you started in the last 5 years with real conviction, and how many of them did you actually stay with long enough to become good at? For most people, the gap between those two numbers is enormous, and it isn't because they're lazy or unfocused by nature or missing some gene that disciplined people supposedly have. It's because almost no one ever taught them what the beginning of mastery actually feels like from the inside. It doesn't feel like progress. For a long time, it feels like nothing is happening at all, so people quit. Not because they chose wrong, because they mistook the feeling of early effort for evidence that the effort wasn't working. Now, you've probably heard some version of tonight's title before, usually shouted, usually with an exclamation point. Focus on one thing. Do only that. Everything else is a distraction, a weakness, proof you're not serious. And there's something in that message worth taking seriously. But taken exactly as it's usually meant, one thing, forever, nothing else allowed, it doesn't hold up. Plenty of people have built real, lasting success while caring about more than one pursuit in their lives. And plenty of narrowly obsessed people have spent decades focused on exactly one thing and never gotten anywhere close to mastering it. So the number was never really the point. Something else was, think about two people who start the exact same pursuit on the exact same day. Same talent, same starting resources, same enthusiasm in week one. If you checked in on them a month later, you probably couldn't tell them apart. Both would be excited. Both would be improving. Both would look, from the outside, like people on their way somewhere. Check in again 8 months later, and something has usually already happened that decides everything that follows. One of them hit a stretch where nothing seemed to be improving, where the effort kept going in, and the results stopped showing up to match it. And they read that stretch as a sign. Wrong path, wrong talent. Time to try something else. The other person hit the exact same stretch, same plateau, same discouraging silence where progress used to be, and they just kept going. Not because they were more talented, because they hadn't yet learned to trust the feeling of stalling as proof of anything. 10 years later, the gap between those two people isn't a gap you can explain with talent anymore. It looks like a different category of person entirely, but it didn't start as one. It started as a single decision, repeated quietly, about what to do, the moment things stopped feeling exciting. That's the part almost no one talks about, because it isn't dramatic enough to put in a highlight reel. Mastery doesn't announce itself. There's no moment where a bell rings and tells you the compounding has officially begun. It just keeps not showing up, week after week, for long enough that most people give up right before it would have arrived. Picture someone digging a well. They pick a spot and they start digging, and for a while it's just dirt, no water, nothing to show for the effort except a hole getting slightly deeper. After some time with no water in sight, doubt creeps in. Maybe this isn't the right spot, so they climb out, walk 50 feet over, and start again. New spot, new hole, same story, dirt, effort, doubt, and eventually the same conclusion. Wrong spot again. By the end of the year, they've dug 8 different holes, none of them deep enough to reach anything, and they're exhausted in a way that has nothing to show for it. Somewhere nearby, someone else picked one spot on the same day and just kept digging. Through the exact same stretch of doubt, through the exact same discouraging silence. No water, nothing changing that they could see. The difference between the two of them was never the ground they chose to dig in. It was what they were willing to do the moment digging stopped feeling like progress That's worth sitting with for a moment because it reframes almost everything about how you've probably judged your own past attempts. When something you started stopped feeling exciting, did you actually run out of interest? Or did you just reach the point where interest alone was no longer enough to carry you, and nothing had taught you what comes after interest runs out? Most people never ask that question. They just assume the boredom was the verdict. Case closed, move on, try something new. And the new thing feels alive again for a while, because everything feels alive at the beginning. That's not evidence you found the right path. That's just what beginnings feel like. Every single time, regardless of what you're beginning. So here's where tonight's real subject starts to come into view, and it isn't really about eliminating everything except one activity from your life forever. It's about something narrower and far more useful than that. It's about what you do in the specific moment your effort stops being rewarded with visible progress. The moment almost everyone reads as failure, when it's usually just the entrance to the part that actually matters. There's a name for the stretch we ended on, the part where effort keeps going in and nothing seems to come back out. Researchers who study skill development call it the valley of disappointment. And once you understand what it actually is, you start recognizing it everywhere in your own history. Here's the shape of it. When you begin something new, your effort and your results rise together for a little while. You practice, you improve, you can feel yourself getting better, and that early feedback is intoxicating. It's why the first weeks of anything feel so good. But then, almost without exception, the results stop keeping pace with the effort. You're still working, you're still showing up, but the visible progress flattens out, sometimes for months, while the actual skill keeps developing quietly underneath, invisible to you, because you can only measure what you can see. That gap between the effort you're putting in and the results you can actually observe is where almost everyone quits. Not because the work stopped paying off, because it stopped paying off visibly, and visibility was the only kind of evidence they knew how to trust. This is worth taking seriously, because it means something uncomfortable. The exact moment that feels most like proof you should quit is usually the moment closest to proof you shouldn't. The valley isn't a detour on the way to mastery. It's the road itself. There isn't a version of getting good at something that skips it. So why does no one warn you about this? Partly because the valley is invisible from the outside too. You don't see someone else's plateau when you're watching them succeed. You only see the finished result, the mastery at the end. And it looks effortless because the boring middle was never filmed. That creates a quiet, dangerous illusion. It looks like other people found the right thing quickly, and you just haven't found yours yet. So instead of pushing through your own valley, you go looking for a different mountain, assuming this one must be the wrong one. That search feels productive. It even feels like ambition. But look closely at what it actually produces over time. Not depth. A collection of beginnings. Think about what beginnings have in common, regardless of what you're beginning. They're exciting. They're full of possibility. Everything feels fresh, because nothing has had time to become difficult yet. That feeling is real, but it's not evidence of the right path. It's just what all paths feel like in their first month, including the wrong ones. If the only feeling you're chasing is that beginning feeling, you'll keep finding it over and over in a new activity every few months, and you'll never once find out what's on the other side of the plateau because you keep leaving right before you'd have to find out. There's an old, uncomfortable truth about mastery worth sitting with directly. It doesn't reward the most talented people. It rewards the people who were willing to be bad at something in public, repeatedly, for long enough that the badness eventually became something else. Talent decides how steep your early curve is. It has almost nothing to do with whether you're still standing on the far side of the valley. History is full of people who prove this quietly, without much drama attached to it. Consider someone who spent years at a craft that, from the outside, looked almost identical every single day. The same repetition, the same discipline, nothing photogenic about it, no dramatic turning point anyone could point to. For a long stretch, an observer watching them work would have seen no obvious signs of anything building. Just the same unglamorous motions, over and over, day after day, in a room no one else was watching. And then, eventually, not suddenly, just eventually, what had been accumulating in silence became undeniable to everyone at once. The mastery didn't arrive on the day people finally noticed it. It had been arriving the entire time, in the years no one thought to pay attention. That's the part almost no one wants to hear, because it isn't dramatic enough to be inspiring on its own. Mastery is not a discovery. It's an accumulation. An accumulation, by definition, doesn't show its full value until long after most people have already decided it isn't working and moved on to something else. So go back to the well diggers for a moment, because there's a second layer to that story worth adding now. The person who dug 8 shallow holes wasn't lazy. They worked hard in every single one of those holes. Real effort, real sweat, real hours. Their failure wasn't a failure of effort. It was a failure of continuity. Every time they got close to the depth where water might have been, they interpreted the difficulty of getting there as proof they'd chosen wrong. And they started over, resetting the depth back to 0, again and again, without ever realizing that the depth was the only thing that mattered, and they kept discarding it right before it counted. That's worth asking yourself honestly, the same way we asked it at the end of the first part of tonight's seminar. How many of your unfinished things were actually the wrong path? And how many of them were simply abandoned in the valley, at the exact point where staying would have started to matter? Most people can't answer that question cleanly, because in the moment, quitting never feels like quitting. It feels like discernment. It feels like finally being honest with yourself about what isn't working. But there's a difference between genuine discernment, recognizing something is truly wrong for you, and simply running from the discomfort that every single pursuit produces once the beginning wears off. One of those is wisdom. The other one just wears wisdom's clothing. The real skill being asked of you here isn't the ability to pick correctly the first time. Almost no one does. The real skill is staying past the point where staying stops feeling good, long enough to find out whether the difficulty was a signal to leave, or simply the entry fee for depth that hadn't been paid yet. This is where the whole idea finally has to earn its keep, because up to now, everything we've said could still sound like advice for people who already know exactly what they want. So let's be honest about the harder version of the question. What if you're not sure your current thing is even worth staying in? That's a fair question. And the answer isn't, never quit anything, ever, no matter what. That would just be the opposite mistake. Mistaking stubbornness for depth, the same way people mistake switching for progress. Some paths really are wrong. Some pursuits really do deserve to be abandoned. The skill being asked of you tonight isn't blind persistence. It's learning to tell the difference between two feelings that are almost identical from the inside, but mean completely different things. One feeling says, "This is hard, and I'm not seeing results yet, and I want to quit." That feeling shows up in the valley of every single pursuit worth doing, without exception. It is not information about whether you chose correctly. It is simply what depth feels like before it pays off. The other feeling is quieter, and it doesn't sound like frustration. It sounds more like a kind of settled misalignment. Not "this is hard," but "this was never actually mine to begin with." Not the ache of difficulty, but the specific ache of doing something that was never built around who you actually are, no matter how good you eventually got at it. Most people never learn to tell these two feelings apart, because both of them show up wearing the same disguise. I don't want to do this anymore. So they treat every instance of that thought identically, and they quit the hard thing at exactly the moment it might have become extraordinary, using the same reasoning they'd use to correctly quit something that was genuinely wrong for them. Here's a way to start telling them apart. The first feeling, the valley, almost always comes with a specific, nameable difficulty. You know exactly what's hard. The skill you haven't developed yet, the plateau you're stuck on, the visible gap between your effort and your results. The second feeling is vaguer than that, and it doesn't resolve when the difficulty resolves. It's less about the specific obstacle in front of you and more about a quiet, persistent sense that even success at this particular thing wouldn't actually satisfy what you're looking for. That distinction won't be perfectly clean every time, but it's far better than the default most people use, which is no distinction at all. Just abandoning anything the moment it stops feeling good and calling that instinct. So here's the decision worth taking from tonight, and it's smaller than pick one thing and eliminate everything else forever. It's this: take the one thing already in front of you right now, the thing you've already started, the one sitting closest to being abandoned, and give it 6 more months before you let yourself decide it was the wrong path. Not 6 more months of waiting passively to feel differently about it. 6 more months of the actual work, through the actual valley, paying attention the entire time to which of the two feelings you're really having. If, at the end of that 6 months, it's the second feeling, the quiet misalignment, not the loud difficulty, then leaving is honest, and you should leave without guilt. That was genuine discernment, not avoidance. But if it's the first feeling, and you already know it is, because you recognized it the moment we described it a few minutes ago, then those 6 months aren't a sacrifice. They're the entry fee you haven't paid yet for something you already started buying, with every hour you've put in so far. Go back, one last time, to the two well diggers. The difference between them was never which spot they chose. It was never even how hard they worked, because both of them worked hard, in every hole they dug. The difference was continuity. One person let the depth accumulate, and the other kept resetting it back to zero, convinced each time that starting over was progress. DOT doesn't care how many times you've started. It only counts the digging that never stopped. That's the quiet, undramatic truth sitting underneath tonight's title, once you strip away the exclamation point. It was never really about the number one. It was about whether you're willing to stay in a single hole long enough to find out what's actually down there. Long after it stopped feeling exciting, long after the beginning wore off, long after anyone else was still watching to see if you'd finish. Most people never find out. Not because the water wasn't there, because they climbed out one hole too soon.